Vietnam, 1967. American patrols are vanishing in the jungle. Rescue teams find the bodies later. The scene is always the same. Soldiers lie dead next to their rifles. The weapons are disassembled. Springs, pins, and bolts are scattered in the mud. Why were they cleaning guns during a firefight? The answer was a death sentence. The M16 had jammed. In the final seconds of their lives, these men weren't shooting. They were struggling with a mechanical failure. Some used their rifles as clubs. Others died reaching for enemy AK-47s. Their own weapon had become a plastic and steel redundant weight. For years, the Pentagon kept the files locked. They blamed the soldiers, they blamed the climate. But the cover-up hid a darker reality of bureaucratic negligence. The truth didn't emerge until thousands of caskets had already returned home. It began with a promise of a miracle weapon that required no maintenance. The military-industrial complex had gambled with lives and lost. 1965. The American ground war in Vietnam shifts into high gear. Thousands of soldiers step off transports into the heat of Southeast Asia. They carry the M16, a sleek black lightweight rifle. Military brass called it a miracle, the most modern weapon on Earth. Every grunt believed the hype. They held the cutting edge of technology. Their enemy, the Viet Cong, carried weathered AK-47s and rusted bolt actions from the Second World War. On paper, it was a mismatch. The Americans had the future, the guerrillas had the past. But how did the future hold up in the mud? The answer came in the first major firefights. Patrols pushed into the thick jungle scrub and flooded rice paddies. Contact was sudden, violent. After only 2 or 3 magazines, the shock hit. The miracle gun died. The M16 fired once, then seized. It failed to cycle. It refused to extract the spent brass. The casing stayed stuck in the chamber, turning the rifle into a useless club. Chaos followed. Soldiers dropped their jammed weapons and grabbed rifles from fallen comrades. Those jammed too. Men crawled into the mud under heavy fire. They pulled charging handles. They ripped their rifles apart in the dirt, desperately searching for the glitch. In many cases, there was no fix. They were trapped in a kill zone with a plastic toy. Reliable reports from the front lines began to reach Washington by the end of 1966. The reports from the jungle were no longer just rumors. They were a death toll. By late 1966, the Pentagon faced a reality that defied every ballistic test. Whole platoons watched their firepower vanish in seconds. During one engagement, nearly 33% of M16 rifles simply quit. The soldiers didn't retreat. They couldn't. The fight turned primitive. Men swung empty rifle butts. They lunged with bayonets. They threw every grenade in their pouches. Those lucky enough to find a shotgun or a captured AK-47 held onto them like a lifeline. Could a plastic rifle really hold up in a monsoon? Investigators soon found the answer in the mud. They discovered American bodies slumped over disassembled weapons. Some were killed while driving cleaning rods down their own barrels. They died trying to fix a machine that had already failed them. Trust didn't just fade, it shattered. Soldiers began scrounging for the heavy M14 rifles the M16 was supposed to replace. They traded rations for unauthorized pistols. The Army had promised them the finest combat instrument in history. It worked perfectly on the firing ranges of Maryland, but after 2 magazines in the humid heat of the Highlands, the black rifle turned into a useless stick of scrap metal. In the middle of the most high-tech war in history, the American infantryman was reduced to fighting with his hands. The Ordnance Department ignored the frantic radio calls for months. The rifle was a death trap. Infantrymen called it a jam-o-matic. The most lethal defect was the failure to extract. A fired cartridge case would expand. It gripped the chamber walls like a vice. The extractor claw on the bolt would cycle back, hit the rim, and simply rip through the brass. The spent casing stayed wedged in the dark. How do you fix a jammed rifle under fire? You don't. Not without a cleaning rod. You had to slide the rod down the muzzle and hammer the casing out from the front. But the Army hadn't issued the rods to the first units. Soldiers used sticks. They used twigs. They died with disassembled rifles in their laps. Was it a lack of maintenance? No. The chambers were not chrome-lined. In the humidity of Southeast Asia, the steel pitted and corroded within days. This rough surface acted like sandpaper, grabbing every shell. Even a clean rifle would fail after just 2 magazines. Carbon fouled the internals. The rate of fire became erratic. The weapon felt possessed. Investigators from Colt and the Army finally started digging. Journalists and Congress followed the trail of bodies. They found a single devastating change in the production line. During the testing phase, the AR-15 used a specific propellant. It was an extruded stick powder called IMR-4475, manufactured by DuPont. The rifle was optimized for its burn rate. It left almost no residue in the gas system. With DuPont powder, the M16 was a masterpiece of engineering. Then came the decision of 1964. The decision made in 1964 changed everything. Tens of thousands of infantrymen headed to Vietnam with the M16. They believed the marketing. They thought they carried the most advanced rifle on the planet. They were wrong. What went into their hands was a weapon sabotaged by its own ammunition. At the last moment, the Army switched the propellant. They replaced the clean-burning DuPont powder with a dirty, hotter alternative. Why did this matter? The rifle was a precision instrument tuned for one specific pressure. The new powder destroyed that balance. It pushed the bolt carrier back too fast. It spiked the cyclic rate far beyond Eugene Stoner's design. The pressure was too high. The steel was under too much stress. Imagine the heat of the jungle. A soldier pulls the trigger. The extractor claws at the brass casing, but the pressure is immense. The rim of the cartridge tears clean off. The rest of the shell stays welded inside the chamber. The rifle is now a club. Carbon and unburned granules flooded the gas tube. They coated the bolt carrier. In the tropical humidity, this residue baked into a thick, gritty crust. It acted like industrial cement. The Army called it a self-cleaning rifle. Because of this lie, they issued no cleaning kits, no brushes, no rods, nothing. Soldiers wrote letters home begging for sewing machine oil. They used sticks to scrape out the carbon. It wasn't enough. The unlined chambers began to rust and pit within days. Fouling turned the weapon into a death trap. Men were dying in firefights because their gear failed. Army ordnance saw the reports. They saw the body bags. They did not stop the shipments. Colt promised a revolution. Their promotional brochures called the M16 a self-cleaning rifle. The gas system and new material supposedly eliminated the need for maintenance. Bureaucrats in Washington bought the myth. They sold it to the Pentagon. They sold it to the press. But the jungle does not read brochures. Why did the Army send the first massive shipments without basic supplies? The answer was simple. They believed their own marketing. Thousands of rifles arrived in Vietnam without .22 caliber cleaning kits. No brushes, no rods, no oil. The manual said the weapon was maintenance-free. The reality was a rifle that seized tight after 3 magazines. Carbon fouling turned to cement in the humidity. Soldiers improvised to stay alive. They scrubbed bolts with aviation fuel. They used rags soaked in motor oil. In desperate letters home, young men begged their parents to buy civilian cleaning rods and mail them to the front. Imagine the scene. A firefight breaks out in the tall grass. A dry click replaces the roar of the rifle. One soldier in the entire platoon has a cleaning rod. He does not stay in his hole. He crawls through the mud under heavy fire. He reaches a jammed rifle. He hammers the rod down the hot barrel to mortar out a stuck casing. The weapon clears. He crawls to the next man, then the next. He runs between positions, acting as a mobile repair shop while bullets snap overhead. He kept moving until a round found him. He died with a cleaning rod in his hand because the Army forgot to put one in his crate. He was 19 years old. The Army forgot the lesson of the cleaning rods. Instead of tools to keep the rifle running, they gave the soldiers a button to force it to fail. The Army Ordnance Department insisted on a forward assist. Eugene Stoner and the Air Force protested. They knew the original design was enough. If a round failed to chamber, the shooter simply cycled the charging handle. It was clean, it was logical. But the bureaucrats wanted a way to pound the bolt home by hand. They wanted the feel of an old bolt-action rifle in a space-age weapon. Why fix the underlying cause when you can just hammer the symptom? In theory, the forward assist helped a slightly misaligned bolt. In practice, it was a trap. If the chamber was fouled or the casing was swollen, the button became a curse. A soldier would slam his palm against the assist to force the round in. It didn't clear the jam, it welded the malfunction shut. The rifle didn't just stop, it died. The magazines offered no relief. They were thin aluminum, designed to be used once and thrown away. But the supply chain failed, and soldiers had to reuse them for months. The metal was soft. The feed lips bent under the slightest pressure from a thumb. He would take the magazine and strike it hard against his steel helmet. One sharp blow. Two. This wasn't a Hollywood gesture for the cameras. It was a desperate attempt to align the cartridges and prevent a jam before the first shot. The springs inside were too weak to fight the friction of the jungle. Trust in the weapon vanished. To save the spring, the men stopped filling the magazines to capacity. A 20-round box became an 18-round box. In a world of automatic fire, every soldier went into the bush intentionally short on ammunition. He slid the magazine into the well, clicked it into place, and left the last 2 rounds in his pocket. But even reinforced magazines could not kill as effectively as a decision made in a quiet office thousands of miles from the front. In 1964, the war was hungry for lead. The Pentagon needed millions of rounds. They had a problem with the propellant for the 5.56 cartridge. The solution sat in dusty warehouses. Vast stockpiles of WC-846 ball powder remained from the Second World War. It was designed for heavy artillery and old machines. It was cheap. It was available. Most importantly, the Army Ordnance Department already owned it. Why change a perfect formula? The answer is cynical. The old powder cost less and had been sitting in crates since 1945. The bureaucrats signed the order. At the factory, workers swapped the high-grade propellant for the surplus ball powder. No one stopped the assembly line. No one ran long-term compatibility tests. The chemistry was a death sentence. The original powder burned clean. The WC-846 was a disaster. Inside the rifle, the gas port pressure spiked. The cyclic rate climbed too high, tearing at the internal parts. Then came the fouling. Thick, black, sticky carbon began to coat the chamber. It wasn't just dust, it was a heavy sludge that acted like glue. In the heat of the jungle, this residue baked onto the metal. The rifle's gas system choked on its own breath. The Army ignored the warnings. They bypassed the man who built the weapon. Eugene Stoner was not even notified about the change. Letters home from Vietnam carried a death sentence. Soldiers wrote to their parents about rifles that jammed in the middle of a firefight. Then the press picked up the stories. The American public saw reports of Marines found dead next to disassembled weapons. The military's silence broke. When the number of funeral notices became impossible to hide, the Army finally admitted the truth. The problem wasn't the soldiers, it was the system. Congressional hearings began in 1967. Investigators demanded answers. They found a weapon that had been sabotaged by its own bureaucracy. The fix was immediate. Thousands of cleaning kits and lubricants reached the front lines by air. New production rifles received a trapdoor in the buttstock. It held a brush and a rod. Now the kit stayed with the weapon. Cleaning became a matter of survival. Engineers finally implemented the solution they had ignored for years. They added chrome lining to the chamber and the entire bore. This prevented corrosion in the jungle humidity. It stopped spent casings from sticking to the walls. The rifle's silhouette changed. The original 3-prong flash hider, which constantly snagged on thick vines, disappeared. A closed birdcage design took its place. It kept debris out of the muzzle. Inside the weapon, the mechanics shifted. A revised buffer and spring assembly absorbed the violent recoil of the new powder. The gas port underwent recalibration. These changes stabilized the internal pressure and brought the cyclic rate back down to 700 rounds per minute. Chrome lining protected the metal. But to make the rifle live, the military had to reverse the great betrayal of 1964. It started with the powder. Was the rifle's design the true killer? No. Engineers proved it by returning to the original propellant. In later trials, the M16A1 used ammunition loaded with the initial specifications. The catastrophic failures vanished. The fix was mechanical and chemical. The open duckbill flash hider, a trap for jungle debris, disappeared. A closed birdcage design took its place. Then, the Ordnance Corps finally reformulated the ammunition. The 5.56 round kept its velocity, but changed its soul. New ball powders replaced the old, dirty mixtures. The results were instant. Carbon buildup dropped. The gas pressure curve stabilized. 1,000 rounds. In early '67, a rifle might jam every few dozen shots. After the propellant change, the failure rate plummeted to near zero. Feeding issues died next. The fragile 20-round magazines gave way to reinforced designs. Soon, the 30-round curved magazine became the standard. The weapon stopped fighting its owner. By the end of the conflict, the M16A1 achieved reliability ratings that rivaled the Soviet AK. The rifle had become a completely different weapon. While bureaucrats in Washington rewritten the reports, something strange happened in the jungles of Vietnam. The rifle worked perfectly. 1962. The first AR-15 rifles arrived in silence. They were not for the masses. They went to elite advisors and South Vietnamese special units. These men were professionals. They lived in the mud, but they obsessed over their gear. Why did the first tests fail to show any flaws? The answer was simple: the users. Special forces knew how to maintain a weapon. They cleaned the chambers. They watched the springs. To them, the AR-15 was a miracle of physics. A soldier gripped the rifle. The plastic stock felt cool, not heavy like the old wood. He stepped into the swamp. The aluminum receiver stayed light. It did not swell or warp in the tropical heat. He fired 10 rounds, then 20. No jams. The reports flew back to the Pentagon. Superior in every way, they claimed. Elite units praised the lethal accuracy and the featherweight frame during long patrols against the Viet Cong. Washington saw these glowing files and stopped asking questions. They saw a finished product. In 1965, the ground war escalated. The Army placed orders for tens of thousands of rifles. The AR-15 was no longer an experiment for the elite. It was now the standard for 19-year-old draftees. The brass signed the contracts based on a fantasy. They ignored the gap between a Green Beret and a terrified recruit. These enthusiastic reports from 1962 became the death warrants of 1967. The order for mass production was finalized. Generals were sold on the glowing reports, but the soldiers were sold on the physics. Eugene Stoner's design didn't just look modern, it felt like the future. 7 pounds of aluminum and plastic. That was the magic number. It replaced the heavy, bone-chilling steel of the older generation. A soldier could carry this rifle all day through the jungle and still have the strength to lift it when the brush started screaming. The heart of the weapon was the new 5.56mm cartridge. At the muzzle, the light bullet hit a velocity of 3,200 feet per second. It traveled fast. When that tiny projectile hit dense tissue or bone at high speed, it didn't just pass through, it began to yaw. The bullet tumbled, fragmented, and tore through the body with the violence of a much heavier round. On paper, it was a surgical instrument of death. The recoil was almost non-existent. In semi-automatic mode, the barrel barely moved. In full auto, the weapon remained controllable. A 19-year-old conscript could actually keep a burst on target instead of spraying the canopy. The military had found its holy grail for engagements under 300 yards. They standardized the design. The AR-15 became the M16. It was light, fast, and lethal. Logistics settled the debate. A soldier could carry 3 times the amount of ammunition for the exact same weight as the old 7.62 rounds. The M14 was pushed aside, ending the shortest career of any general-issue rifle in United States history. An infantryman now stepped into the jungle carrying 660 rounds. To reach these speeds, Eugene Stoner had to shrink everything but his ambition. He turned his focus away from the heavy slugs of the past toward the small-caliber, high-velocity concept. What was Stoner's primary goal? Speed over mass. He looked at experimental small-bore cartridges like the .223 Remington. This round would later evolve into the 5.56 NATO. The logic was simple physics. A lighter bullet traveling at 3,200 feet per second creates massive tissue damage. Yet the recoil remains negligible. The AR-10 was the older brother. It was a sophisticated machine of steel and aluminum, but it was chambered for the heavy 7.62 round. Stoner took its internal architecture and scaled it down. He stripped away the weight and re-engineered the bolt for the smaller cartridge. This was not a tool for a dirty war. It was an engineering masterpiece. By shrinking the rifle, Stoner doubled the soldier's effectiveness. More rounds in the magazine, more control during rapid fire. The final result was the AR-15. A gas tube returns propellant gases directly into the bolt. This was the mechanical heart of Eugene Stoner's vision. Behind his design stood more than just engineering math. It was a radical shift fueled by a secret Pentagon research program called Project Salvo. The military faced a lethal contradiction. Heavy rounds meant more power, but less ammunition in the soldier's pouch. Planners stopped asking how hard a bullet hits. They began asking how likely it was to hit at all. Probability replaced raw energy as the new doctrine of survival. Stoner arrived at Armalite during this philosophical rift. While the Army clung to the heavy M14, Stoner built the AR-10. He abandoned the era of wood and heavy steel. Instead, he used aircraft-grade aluminum for the receiver and synthetic furniture to shed weight. The internal mechanics changed the physics of the rifle. The gas system used the bolt and carrier as an internal piston. This created a straight-line layout from the barrel to the stock. Recoil became manageable. The rifle stopped fighting the shooter. The Pentagon officially shifted its priority from individual stopping power to a high-volume saturation of the battlefield. The theory of a low-impulse rifle would have remained a laboratory dream if the M14 had not failed so spectacularly. It was the Pentagon's ultimate compromise. One rifle to replace the Garand, the carbine, and the submachine gun. One cartridge for the entire NATO alliance. The new 7.62mm NATO round promised 30-06 power in a shorter case. On paper, the M14 ticked every box. It had a 20-round magazine and a selector switch for full auto fire. But the steel and wood beast weighed 10 pounds loaded. Why change a proven caliber? In the mud of a real firefight, the M14 became a liability. A soldier flips the selector to auto and pulls the trigger. The first bullet flies true. The second hits the trees. By the third, the muzzle is pointing at the clouds. The heavy 7.62 rounds produce a useless, deafening roar. Effective range was 300 yards, a statistic from World War II that planners simply ignored. Most combat happened well within that distance. At these ranges, the full-power rifle was overkill. The recoil was too violent for rapid fire. The ammunition was too heavy to carry in bulk. Across the alliance, many armies eventually welded the selector switches shut. A full-auto rifle that couldn't be aimed was just a heavy club. The infantry moved through the brush, exhausted by the weight of a weapon designed for a war that no longer existed. The dream of the generals was a single cartridge. The reality for the sergeants was 5 different calibers in a single squad. 1945 revealed a logistical nightmare. The American arsenal resembled a disorganized zoo. In a single platoon, one soldier carried an M1 Garand, another hauled a Browning automatic rifle, a third lugged an M1919 machine gun. All 3 required .30-06 ammunition. But the diversity didn't stop there. Submachine gunners gripped Thompsons or M3 grease guns chambered in .45 ACP. Meanwhile, support troops carried the M1 carbine with its own unique .30 caliber round. Supplying the front line became a headache of mismatched crates and wasted space. A single squad could require 4 different types of ammunition at once. Every weapon needed its own specific spare parts. Every soldier needed training on a different manual of arms. The M14 was a desperate attempt to fix this 1945 disaster. The military demanded unification at any cost. They wanted one rifle to replace the submachine gun, the carbine, and the light machine gun simultaneously. The Ordnance Corps issued a directive to consolidate the entire small arms inventory into one platform. The chaos of 1945 and the systemic lies of the early 60s eventually forged America's longest-serving rifle. But the price was not paid in treasury bonds. By the late 60s, the M16A1 had transformed. The jamming stopped. The Mattel toy reputation faded. New recruits arriving in Vietnam saw a reliable, lightweight tool. They cleaned it. They fired it. It worked. The horror of the first generation became a campfire ghost story, an old soldier's myth. A new private held his rifle and saw perfection. Unaware his predecessor died clawing at a stuck bolt. Congress eventually opened the files. Investigations pointed to gross negligence. They found evidence of internal corruption and technical sabotage. The findings were clear. The bureaucracy had sent men to die with a defective product. No handcuffs clicked shut. No officers lost their stars. No officials faced a jury for the M16 disaster. High-ranking decision-makers stayed in their offices. Some even moved up the ladder. The rifle evolved. The M16A1 became the M16A2, then the M16A4. Eventually, it shrunk into the M4 carbine, a compact, modular descendant of Stoner's original vision. The military finally had its one rifle for everything. The Pentagon achieved its dream of total unification. No official was ever fired, demoted, or prosecuted for the thousands of casualties caused by the initial design.